it's Vanessa, the Crafty Gemini, and I'm back with another video in my Samosa Quilt Along video series. And in this video, we're talking about how to quilt your quilt. All right, so let's talk a little bit about ways that you can finish your quilt. One way that you can finish it is by quilting it on this setup here. This is a big frame. I have this machine that rolls back and forth, right to left, and this is called a long arm quilting machine. You may have seen these at your local quilt shop or even at some quilt shows. They'll often have them on display to show people, that they can purchase them and things like that. Now this machine, sometimes you might hear this called, instead of a long arm, either a mid arm or a short arm machine. And over the years, I think we've kind of just lumped them all together into the category of long arm quilting machines, even though they've come out with machines that have a smaller throat space like this one that are kind of more well suited for the home quilter. For somebody who maybe just makes their own quilts and wants to finish them at home, or somebody who makes a lot of charity quilts, baby quilts, and things that you just want to whip up and send off, and you don't want to really be spending all the time to free motion quilt it on a sit-down machine, or you don't want to spend the extra money to send it off to a professional long arm quilter. So this is a great machine for the home quilter because it's small, compact, but it's so easy to use too, and you can do everything with it. Now this machine is called the Qnique. This is the 14 plus, I think now it's called the 15 or 15R. Basically from the back of the machine here to where the needle is positioned, that measures 15 inches. So this is a smaller machine. Some long arm machines will go as wide in the throat space part here, upwards of 30 something inches, 32, 34 inches and things like that. So those are the big commercial kind of really professional long arm quilting machines that often have software built into them so that it can stitch by itself. It's computerized. This one does not work like that. This is all manual, and so we have to move the machine and have it quilt what designs we want to do. So it's what we call freehand long arm quilting, right? Or free motion, but on a long arm quilting machine. So I'm not endorsed by these people. This is made by Grace Company. You guys, if you follow me for years, you know where I get all my machines. I got this from Timm at So Many Things. The same way that I buy my Jukies from him, same deal. And the machine comes with all types of setup. You can get it super base level where you do all freehand, and then you can also add the software with the tablet and all the computerized stuff to it. So nowadays, when I first got a long arm 10 years ago, over 10 years ago, because I have one in my home studio, they didn't have all this back then for the home quilter. Nowadays, there's a lot more options, and they're not all $25,000, $30,000. So very affordable options if this is something that you want to get into so that you can quickly and easily finish quilting your quilts. So this, because I have it, is what I'm going to use to finish off my Samosa quilt, and I'll briefly run through how this works. The quilt sandwich that I've talked about in the past, we have our backing fabric, we have a layer of the batting, and then we have the quilt top that we've made, right? The Samosa quilt top. So you're going to layer those three together. When you're loading it on a frame, you load it kind of backwards. You stack your sandwich from the bottom up. So this is my backing fabric, and what we're looking at is the wrong side of it because the right side is underneath, and that's what we want to show when the quilt is done, all right? So this is loaded pretty side facing down. Then I'm going to put my batting on here. That's that middle layer. And I float my batting and my quilt tops. There's a lot of different ways to do this. So then you would load up right here and just put the batting there. And then the last layer is that top layer. So you would load your quilt top, obviously with the pretty side face up so you can see what you're doing. And I'm just showing you so you can see how the layers would come together. But typically I would fold this in half, find the center point, do the same with my batting, make sure I have everything lined up right at the center so that I can work evenly across and not end up with my quilt top scooting one way or the other, where then I may not have enough batting or backing to cover it. But similar to how you would do this by quilting a quilt on your domestic sewing machine, you always want to have your batting be a little bit bigger than the top and the backing be even bigger than the batting, okay? That is definitely the case when you're loading it on a long arm because we need to have extra here to load it onto whatever system is in place for that frame to hook up the backing fabric to the leaders, okay? To the rollers and these leaders. That is how we're going to advance the quilt as we quilt it down in sections. So I'm just going to go through this quickly. There is a basting mode on this machine. I'm so used to quilting on my machine at home that doesn't have any bells and whistles because it's such a basic machine I've had for 10 years that I'm just going to do it the way that I normally do it. And this is not really a tutorial on this method, but just to kind of show you. Now I'm going to come down here. Alright, so I've basted across here and down and across this way and down as far as I can go here. Sometimes it's helpful too. It depends on your machine, the frame that you have in the setup, but I also have these little C-clamps that I can put right here to help keep the quilt top and batting layers together as I go on to quilt. Alright, so that will work there. And then depending on what the quilt design is, you can decide on what you want to do for your quilting. For me, this is just a little sample quilt for this quilt along that I did. And so that means that it's something that I just want to get quilted to be done with. I'm not going to do anything fancy. I think I'm just going to do an overall stippling stitch, like a meander. Let me go into my manual. And I like to stitch in manual mode because that's what I've done over the past 9-10 years. But you can put this machine in stitch regulator mode too. I also stitch super fast. So that's what we're going to do here because that's what I'm used to. But every long arm quilter will have their, preferences. All right, so I'm just going to start quilting here. I'm going to show you how I do it. I'm just going to do basic meandering back and forth. And there's no design to follow. A lot of times people will ask me, well, did you mark it out? When I'm doing something simple like this, I don't need to. I can just, go in there and you're basically doodling with the machine. All right, so here you can see the meandering that I did, and I'm using a light gray thread. This is a really popular color for me, whether I'm working on a quilt that has light fabrics or dark fabrics. As you can see, this one has some really bold and darker colors. It's not like a really pale background, and the gray just blends in very, very nicely, but you still get some really well-defined stitch definition there to kind of make the design that you're freehand quilting on it pop a little bit. Alright, so I'm done quilting my Samosa quilt on the long arm, and I'm going to share with you also a few different ways that you can just quilt it to give you some quilting ideas for you to do it on a regular sit-down sewing machine. So if you don't have a long arm quilting machine and you're just wanting to do this either by hand or on your domestic sewing machine, I'm going to share with you here some options. Here I have a smaller version of my Samosa quilt top, and the way I like to layer my sandwiches, especially if I'm going to be finishing this off with some hand quilting or just on my regular sewing machine, is that every additional layer underneath the quilt top, I like to make the next layer a little bit bigger than the previous, and the same thing goes for the backing. In other words, my quilt top is the smallest of the 3 layers of my quilt sandwich. Then behind that I have my quilt batting, and I'll include a link to my favorite quilt batting to use. This is Quilter's Dream, and the loft level that I like to use is also linked in the description below. We have it in our online shop that you can buy. And then behind that, we have our quilt backing fabric. And of course, this is placed pretty side face out because we want the wrong side touching the quilt batting because it's all a sandwich. So basically, the quilt top is the smallest, then the batting is a little bigger, and then our backing fabric is a little bit bigger than that batting also. Now, whether you're going to quilt this by hand or by machine, there's a lot of different options actually on how you can hold your 3 layers of your quilt sandwich together. One of my favorite methods is by using the Sulky KK2000. It's temporary spray adhesive and it's non-toxic, and this is the one I like to use just to spray the fabric, and then you smooth it back and it's going to help keep the layers together. I would then flip it over and do the same thing to the backing fabric. There's also some more simple systems that you can use, and that's just like by putting in safety pins. You can also do a popular method that I've already done videos for in the past on how to hand baste using some thread just to hold the layers all together. So again, that step is going to be personal preference. Because this is small and in the interest of time here, I'm just going to do the temporary spray adhesive. You don't need much at all. I notice that I flip half of it back and then I smooth it, and then I'll flip the opposite half back and do the same thing. I do that so that I don't have to be trying to deal with a super huge large piece and trying to get it stuck down exactly where I want to. So place it where you want it first, flip half and spray, and then do the other half. So that's done. I'll flip this over. You can see that it holds onto it nicely, nothing's falling off. And then we'll do the same thing for the backing section just to keep everything together. Then I'll move on to showing you on a domestic sewing machine, maybe some options that you might want to consider on how you can quilt to finish off your Samosa quilt top. Now you can go in and of course you can start freehand quilting this either by hand or by machine, but you can also mark yourself some guidelines to follow with your hand stitching or with the machine stitches. So I'm going to take the same 10-inch slicer that we used to make the quilt blocks, and it also has lines on it that you can use for measurements. So say you want to do a line 1/2 inch away from the little Samosa piece in the quilt block, I will just line up the seam at my 1/2 inch mark and follow the edge of the ruler. Now to mark it, I'm using this little chalk marker tool. You can use whatever fabric safe method you prefer to use to mark your rulers with. So if I was doing some hand stitching or hand quilting, I would probably go here, and then if I want to come down this side, I would also do the same thing and mark 1/2 inch over. You can do 1/4 inch, an inch, depending on whatever you're planning to do for yours, okay? So right there. And I like to cross, when I'm making lines like this, I like to cross them so I know exactly where to stop and turn, where the intersection is of both of these echoing lines. They're kind of echoing around the little Samosa quilt shape. Now, if you're using the quilt batting that I recommend, which is a quilter's dream, you only need to quilt within 8 inches of another stitch line. So from here to here is definitely less than 8 inches, and from here to here also, and then also from these stitches of where my lines are marked to the other edge. So really, all you need to do is some simple stitching like this on each of the quilt blocks, and that can easily be done by hand or by machine, and that will be enough to hold your blocks down. Now, if you're wanting to take it a step further, and instead of just doing something simple like this to hold the layers together, you can also go ahead and get crazy with some of the designs. If you like the look of straight lines, you can do lines every 1/2 inch. If you do that, just mark the first line, then use that as your guideline to lay the 1/2 inch mark on the ruler, and then draw the next one, and then move over and do the same thing to the next one. And so this is an easy way to do it so that you take the time up front to draw out the lines and then go back and stitch on them, okay? So that is also another option. If you're like me, maybe you're a little impatient and you just like to jump right in, and I tend to just invent whatever I want as I sit down at the sewing machine to stitch on the blocks. Another chunk here, you can also do just an all over meander, the same thing that I did on the long arm machine, but you can do it on a domestic machine. Now I have a full video series, I believe it's 7 videos on free motion quilting. If that's something that you want to get into, I'll include a link so that you can watch those videos, and that will help you get started, how to set up your machine, and some exercises to practice to get into that. But for this quilt along, it's a simple quilt. I just want to share with you a few different ways that you can stitch this. I'm going to, I think, do this echo on this opposite one here. So let's measure the 1/2 inch and mark those on both sides of the Samosa piece. And then we'll head over to the sewing machine, and I'm going to stitch these so I can show you how you would do that. All right, so we're here with our little basic quilt sandwich with a couple of markings of where I'm going to stitch it. And I am going to be working on this really inexpensive and affordable, beginner-friendly sewing machine. And the reason I'm doing this is to show you that you can quilt quilts on really inexpensive machines. So if you have a $5,000 or $20,000 long arm, totally you can quilt your quilts. And if you have a $100 or less than a couple $100 sewing machine, you can also quilt your quilts, okay? Because as long as we have some decent quality tools and supplies, you'll be able to do it, obviously with just a little bit of more work. So I'm working with a smaller quilt sandwich here. If you have a larger quilt, just bundle it up so that the drag and the weight of the quilt is not dragging this and wanting to pull it out of the machine bed. If you have an extension table for your machine that will allow you a larger work surface, that also helps. So there's a lot of different things that you can work on to make it easier for you to finish your quilts. But I'm going to start off on this corner, and I just have some all-purpose cotton thread in this machine, gray. You can choose whatever color you want. I like to work with gray a lot of times because it tends to blend in, whether I'm using lighter fabrics or darker fabrics. My stitch length, and this is personal preference, I would stay away from really small stitches because we are sewing through 3 layers, which is adding more bulk. But you don't want to go huge basting stitch either. So I like to keep my stitch length at about a 2.5 to 3 millimeter length for the quilting when I go over, through the 3 layers. So I'm just going to start off on one end. I'm going to stitch down my marked line. I'll pivot at the tip here and then just come down. And now you'll probably notice also that I'm not using a walking foot. That's going to depend a lot on your machine. I find that on this machine, I can get away with it just by loosening up the presser foot pressure, and that is the amount of chomp, basically, on the presser foot to the fabric. So if you loosen that up, and not all machines will have this dial, but on this one I know that if I loosen it up, it gives me a little bit more room to fit in the bulkier layers, and I don't really need a walking foot. But if you have a machine that gives you issues with the bulk feeding through the layers evenly, definitely go ahead and feel free to install a walking foot on your machine if you have one. When I pivot, I stop with the needle down, then I can lift my presser foot up. The needle is down, so it's still holding my spot. Then I will turn and come down in the opposite direction. And because I'm coming right off to the edge, I don't have to deal with anything of like burying threads or anything like that. I turn the hand wheel towards me to bring the needle up because it's a mechanical machine. I lift my presser foot up. I pull this out, and then I just cut my threads right as it is. All right, and so that first echoed line of quilting is done on this quilt block. So let's go ahead opposite side and do the same thing to the other one. And you can see how simple it is. It's not that hard. If you're working on a simple project like this, don't worry about filling the entire quilt with a ton of quilting, especially for your first one. And if you're using just a smaller domestic sewing machine and making a larger quilt, because you'll have to turn everything and just take it one block at a time, nice and slowly. Now really quickly here we just started off on the end, pivoted and came off on the other end because that block happened to be on an edge where I didn't really have to deal too much with burying threads because my binding is going to cover those seams right at the end. So if you're coming here to like this block where I am starting off at a seam intersection inside the quilt, meaning it's not off to the side, you don't just want to start sewing there. So I'll show you how you would do this. I haven't done anything yet. I have the top thread tail. I'm going to turn the hand wheel towards me to go into the project, and I continue to make one full rotation so that now I can pull with this hand, and let me lift the presser foot up so you can see it. When I pull with this hand, I can see under here that I've brought up the bobbin thread with me. So let me grab a seam ripper or a pin, anything that you can get in there pointy to help you pull that out. So if I pull the project out, you can see here, when I tug on this, you see this thread that's coming here? This is the bobbin thread because I did a full rotation, meaning I did a full stitch. So I've brought the bobbin thread up to the top of my project, and I have my top thread here. So now I know that I won't have any nasty knots underneath. So with that bobbin thread up, go ahead and place it under your presser foot again. Presser foot down. And I'm going to turn the hand wheel and bring that needle right back in where those threads were coming out of. So I like to just either by hand take 1 or 2 stitches in place there just to kind of anchor that down. I'll leave these long tails off to the side, and I think I'm going to lengthen my stitch just a little, and then we'll just come down and pivot, and I'll show you how to finish it off here also because we're not off on an edge. We need to bring up the bobbin thread on the end here also so we don't end up with jumbled up thread nests in the back of our quilt backing. One more stitch right on that pivot point to make sure the needle's in. Presser foot up. I can pivot here, line it up, drop the needle or the presser foot. Now you'll see that when you get a bigger quilt, this is what you're gonna have to do, and kind of like bundle this and roll it up out of your way so it doesn't get caught up on the body of the machine. I'm gonna keep stitching till I get to this seam intersection here. And now I wanna stop with the needle down first, okay? Right at the pivot, or excuse me, right at the intersection. So now my needle's up. I'm going to lift my presser foot. I'm gonna pull my quilt sandwich out, and this thread is still connected. Don't cut it yet. I'm gonna grab the thread, this is coming through my needle from the top, and pull it out some. So I give myself some slack, and then reline up the needle position on exactly where that thread is coming out of when we hit that intersection. And then I'll bring the needle back down into it and back up for a full rotation. So it went down, basically picked up the bobbin thread. Now we can lift up the presser foot. And you'll see what happens here when I'm still holding on to this and I pull it. Now we have thread coming up from the bottom also. So now we can cut all this. And this is of course assuming that you took a couple stitches at the end there to lock it into place and secure it. Otherwise you would want to tie a knot here and bury the knot threads. If you go smaller with your stitch length, or you just take a few stitches in place before you do that, that should be plenty to hold that in place. So there's a lot of little shortcuts and things that you can do, but if we flip it to the back, you can see it's nice and smooth and the stitching just ends right there without a clumped up knotty mess. All right, so that's how you do it both on the ends and inside the seam intersection. At the beginning here where we still have these thread tails, I'm just gonna use my seam ripper to cut that off. And the same thing goes for the end there also. Okay, so no knots. And that's how you bring up the bobbin thread to make sure you have some clean starts and finish inside the interior parts of your quilt. All right, so if you use a chalk marker, just go ahead and rub off any lines, ones that you stitched on or ones that you decided not to stitch on, if that was your case too. The next step is going to be to trim up your quilt, right? By trimming up around the edges here. After I trim, I like to go in about 1/8 of an inch with a really long stitch length, about 5 or even up to 7 millimeters in length, depending on what your machine will allow you to do. And then just stitch around all 4 sides of the quilt just to anchor down those edges, okay? And then you would just bind it to finish off the quilt. So I will show you on the one that I did on the long arm. As we did the basting on it, that is the basting right here. It's less than 1/4 of an inch away from the edge so that I can ensure that once I attach the binding, all these stitches are concealed. But before then, so that when I attach the binding, I don't run the risk of any of the fabric on the quilt top flipping back on me and getting caught outside of the binding. This is a very helpful step, and it's quite simple and quick and easy to do even if you're working on a larger quilt. So just stitch a little bit of a ways in from the edge around all 4 sides of your quilt. Now to finish it off, both for that basting stitch and then how to measure and make the binding for this, I am going to include full video playlists for those videos because I've already done it in the past. I have several different binding videos, squaring up your quilt videos, and all the remaining steps that you would need to go ahead and finish off your Samosa quilt. So I will definitely link to all of those here. And then I'll also include a link to some videos that I have on hand stitching your quilt. So if you're wanting to do this, because it's not a lot of stitching, this would look really cute with some hand quilting stitches. I will also link you to the video that I have on how to do that, how to start and stop, and how to even mark out the lines and stitch on them. I have videos already done for that. If you're ever looking for something on a video tutorial on a topic that you're not sure if I've done a video for, all you have to do is do a search for whatever the keyword is that you're looking for, say quilt binding, and then follow it up with the words CraftyGemini. If I have a video on that topic, the video will pop up for you right here on YouTube. So that's another great way for you to surf the over 500 plus instructional video tutorials that I have already posted on my YouTube channel. Okay, so keep that in mind. But you can see on the back side, all we end up with are these kind of little triangular bits of stitches because I did the same design on all 4 blocks. And that's the quilting that you'll end up with in your finished project. So that's all you gotta do. trim it up, make and attach the binding, and then your Samosa quilt top will be done. So that is it for this video series. I hope that you'll give this project a try. Remember to click on the link included for you in the description box below so you can check out the links for the videos needed to finish completing your quilt top in case this is the first quilt that you've ever made. But otherwise, I hope you enjoyed learning how to make the Samosa quilt top, that you enjoyed using my 10-inch slicer ruler, and that you'll play around with the block orientation and feel free to take pictures. You can upload them to the different social media sites using the hashtag craftygemini and Samosa quilts, because I definitely want to see the fun fabrics that you use to create this quilt project also. Thanks again for watching this video series. Let me know what you thought about it in the comment section below, and I will see you in the next video.